All right, everybody. It looks like WebEx was updated for the county, so be patient with me as people are logging in. I'm trying to mute them as we go along and accessing this new WebEx, which will be really fun to see what new features they have. While we're waiting for our presenter, he is Dr. Roberts from Granger Medical. He's going to be a couple minutes late today. So in the meantime, I want to go over with you some points we're offering this month for September. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see here. Okay. Can everybody see my screen, I hope? All right, so for September, if you go to your WellSteps account and then rewards, if you scroll down to the bottom, you will see Drive Your Intention. This is a new campaign we're doing this month, and it is all about mental health. So the first thing you can do for 15 points is complete the Drive Your Intention mini campaign. And how you do that is you scroll back up to the top and you click here on campaigns. And while you are here, it has all the steps on how to complete this 15-point activity. You watch this short video and it teaches you how to set an intention for your day. For example, today I have to accept what happens to me as if I chose for it to happen to me is my intention. And I just wrote that down in my planner, but I marked it off on Monday. And you can do the same for all these days. And if you complete at least half of the days, then you should receive 15 points. Something else you can do is watch our suicide prevention presentation. This was done last week. We had Brianne Silcox from the health department. She's the suicide prevention coordinator over there. And she presented on all the different signs that you can see within those around you if they are experiencing higher levels of depression or maybe experiencing suicidal thoughts, especially with everything going on right now. You can access that workshop on our YouTube channel. Trying to pull it up. There we go. So if you go to Healthy Lifestyles SLCO, or even our website has a link to our YouTube channel, you can access so many different things. We have our Mindful Monday recordings, we have yoga with Tammy, and we also have our wellness workshops, and that's where you will find that suicide prevention workshop. You can also click on videos, and it's the very first one that you see is that suicide prevention presentation. So when you are finished watching that on your own time, you mark it off right here on your WellSteps. We are also accepting donations to Salt Lake County's youth services for the emotional first aid kits. And how that works is you can donate different support items like crayons or a stuffed animal, different things that can help them emotionally. And we also, this link on your WellSteps gives more details for items that they accept and where to drop those off. And then, of course, we're giving 5 points if you complete one of those Mindful Monday recordings or yoga activities on our YouTube channel that I showed before. Does anybody have any questions on those before we jump into the workshop? You can put them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself if you'd like. All right, excellent. And to get points for attending today, I'm going to link a sign-in sheet in the chat box, and that's how you can get your 10 points for today. And Kim, do we have Dr. Roberts on?
Sorry, can you repeat how we can get points again today? I missed that part.
Points today are by signing in using the link that I put in the chat box, and I will do that right now.
Sadie, I don't see him on yet, but I know he is doing his best to get here ASAP.
Awesome, thank you. And while we're waiting, does anyone have any healthy lifestyles questions about really anything? This is a free forum while we wait for Dr. Roberts.
Sadie, I can't find the chat box anymore. I used to be able to see it.
I'm seeing mine is in the right-hand lower corner. It says participants in chat. I know you can also access it if you go to File in the left-hand corner and then Open Chat. Does that help at all? Hopefully that silence means that you found it. File, Open Chat, or the bottom right-hand corner is where I'm seeing it. I'm not sure if it looks different on other people's computers. I can tell you guys a little bit about how Paint the County Pink will look this year. All of our staff is working remotely, and we are doing all of our programs from home, and we're trying to make it so that you can do the same because we know a lot of you are working on COVID or you're working remotely. And so for Women's Health Month, we're actually going to have everything remotely, and it will work by we'll have 3 workshops that month, and then we will also have a small activity or a big activity that month, or that week, I'm sorry, that you can do as you go. So it's not an all or nothing point. It's just based on how much you can participate. But I will leave those activities as a surprise to make it a little bit more fun. It looks like Dr. Roberts is on with us. Hold 1 second while I mute everybody.
Hello there.
Hi there, Dr. Roberts.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Kim sent me 2 different PowerPoints for you, one on vaccines.
And I've actually made some updates to that. So if I can just share from my screen, I think that'll
That
be
would be even better.
very good. Well, thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry to be a little bit late this afternoon. All right. Do you see this blue PowerPoint here or Google presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Let me get in presentation mode. So thank you for having me back. This is always a pleasure to speak with the employees for Salt Lake County. You guys do a great job taking good care of your employees and the public. Thank you for all of your efforts, especially during this pandemic. We would be lost without you. So this talk is one that I've given a couple of times, and a lot of the material it was borrowed from one of my professors, my medical school professors, Dr. Douglas Campus Outcolt, who is a public health and vaccine guru, has served under a couple of presidents actually as a vaccine advisor, and a guy who I look up to enormously. So he gave me permission to use some of this material. Let's get into it. So a couple of objectives for this session. I'll try to get through these as fast as I can so we can have a little bit of time at the end to take some questions. So the first objective is just to talk about the history of vaccines and how much good has been done to public health because we have vaccines. We'll get into some details about what vaccines are recommended and why and when and what some of the controversies in the past have been. We'll talk about how vaccines get recommended, like who is it that decides, when do we give mumps, measles, and rubella, tetanus, flu here in America. We'll talk about when bad things happen to people who get vaccines and how do we respond and track harm that is done by vaccines. Because yeah, no medicine is risk free, vaccines included. But overall, still the benefit greatly outweighs the harm. And then last of all, just kind of a heartfelt, strong recommendation from me that all of us should receive our recommended vaccines, and that we shouldn't think of ourselves as being an exception, and we shouldn't seek exceptions from vaccines unless we really can't do them. So that's those are my objectives for this lunch talk today. Let's get into it. So this is a slide that was taken from the New England Journal of Medicine, an article that came out in 2012 about the changing reasons that have been listed, since we started tracking this, reasons for people's deaths from 1900 to 2010. So you can see that the number of deaths per 100,000 in an given year has dramatically dropped from 1900 to 2010, which is good. So fewer people dying every year per capita. And also the reasons of death have changed dramatically. So back in 1900, a huge percentage of people who died due to pneumonia or influenza. About an equal percentage of people who died due to tuberculosis. And then a smaller number of people died from gastrointestinal infections, things like cholera. And then you start to have some of the diseases that we still have with us today. Heart disease, stroke, kidney failure, accidents. Cancer actually made up a very small percentage of deaths in 1900. And then you have these other diseases which we hardly see. So diphtheria, as a throat infection, which is very rare, thank God, today and age. And then senility, which is kind of a wastebasket term that we don't use very much anymore. But just, I guess the term we would use for that would be more like old age, death from natural causes. So jump ahead 110 years, and you can see that the number one killer of Americans today is heart disease, followed very closely by cancer. And you can see that the number of cases of cancer has risen pretty dramatically from 1900 to 2010. Now, there's a lot of questions about that. Why do we have more cancer? And the answer that most doctors agree on is that we're just living longer, right? So this is actually a side effect of longer lifespan. The longer you live, the more likely you are to be diagnosed with a cancer of some sort. But there are also some cancers that are on the rise. We are seeing truly larger numbers of young, healthy people being diagnosed with cancer. And we think that is likely due to our modern American lifestyle, unfortunately. We don't eat well, we don't exercise, we don't sleep enough. We have a lot of pollution and other environmental exposures that we know increase our risk for cancer. So that's an evolving field in medicine, obviously. And then you see these other small categories, and in here are, where is it? So pneumonia or influenza. You can see this tiny, tiny little sliver of deaths compared to this large chunk of pneumonia and influenza in 1900. Tuberculosis is no longer on the map. Gastrointestinal infections no longer on the map, likely due to clean water initiatives and other public health measures. Diphtheria completely off the map. So this is a huge success story. Infectious diseases, which used to account for more than half of the deaths every year, now account for only a tiny sliver of deaths every year. And the only thing that can really explain that, other than clean water, is vaccination. That is the only explanation powerful enough to make this make sense. So that's a huge improvement, huge achievement. I won't spend as much time on the other slides as I did on this one, just because I wanted everyone to see the dramatic drop in deaths that are due to vaccines. So I apologize for this graphic image, but I do think it's important for us to know that there are diseases which we no longer see, thank God, things like smallpox, because of vaccines. So smallpox has been the scourge of humankind for millennia, and has killed more people than any other disease throughout our history as a species. Smallpox is now eradicated in the wild. We haven't had a single case of smallpox besides people who were exposed to it in like a lab setting since the 70s. And that can only be attributed to a very successful campaign of vaccination that was done via the World Health Organization. And you can see that even if a person survived smallpox, they would have severe deformities and issues the rest of their life as a result of being a victim of that. And this is just something that's gone. It's gone like the dinosaur. And hopefully it's not the last disease that we'll see become eradicated. We're very close with a couple of other diseases as well, including polio, which we'll get to. So let's talk about the history of mandatory vaccination. This is a very controversial, hot topic. Does the United States, do countries have a right to force their citizens to become vaccinated? And the answer is yes. And this is a precedent that goes back to 1905, a Supreme Court case in which the court upheld the state of Massachusetts in its requirement that citizens be forced to undergo compulsory vaccination. And that law that precedent has never been overturned. And so, in a word, the government does have the right to make its citizens become vaccinated against infectious disease, and has enforced that many times throughout history. And even though it's controversial and can be seen as the nanny state or whatever, I think that public health experts and doctors would agree that in some situations this is not necessary. We all consent to mandatory vaccination requirements when we send our children to school, to public school, for example. And how those, which ones have to be, given, we'll get into who makes those recommendations in a moment. So let's talk also about polio briefly. Now, some of you may have been alive when polio was still a big problem that was ravaging the United States. When there were summers very much like the summer we just spent, where swimming pools were closed and movie theaters were closed because of polio outbreaks. Polio does still exist, wild polio in certain parts of the world, in the developing world. But we are making giant strides to eradicating this as well. Just in the past few months, wild polio has been eradicated from Africa, which is one of the few places left on Earth where we still see it. There are still a couple of places in Asia where polio is still an issue. But in North and South America, we have not had a case of wild polio now for decades. And that is, again, directly related to the emergence of vaccines. So if you look at the case rate of polio in the United States, here we have data going back to 1920, and you can see that in 1955 was our very first polio vaccine. It was what we call a killed vaccine, meaning that the polio virus was boiled in boiling water or otherwise killed with chemicals so that it became inactivated. And so unfortunately, this killed vaccine wasn't terribly effective, but you can see the trend here between 1955 and 1960 is a nice downward trend, more so than the typical ups and downs, kind of the noisy trend of the previous 50 years or 30 years. And then in 1960, we had our first live, what we call attenuated vaccine, meaning that the virus is whole, it's a whole virus particle, but that virus has been dumbed down, it's been weakened significantly with some molecular changes. And then we have another, even better live vaccine that comes out a few years later. And now you really see this dramatic drop in cases of polio. And if you could carry this line out to the present day, you'd see this approaching zero. Really, nothing else explains this dramatic decrease other than the arrival of these vaccines. So I don't know how many people have ever seen one of these, but this is an iron lung. So these actually were quite common medical appliances seen in most hospitals. up until the recent past. It's a negative pressure chamber, which is used to ventilate a person without having to put a tube down into their throat. This is an old model that was this picture was taken outside of a clinic in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I love the sign here. It says, vaccines made this iron lung obsolete. Don't bring it back. So isn't it wonderful that, we no longer need these things? Hospitals don't routinely have to have an entire ward full of iron lungs to treat people who are suffering from post-polio, which is great. So let's talk about, the history of vaccines. So the very first vaccine, some people may know the story of Dr. Edward Jenner, who actually gave the vaccine to his own children. Kind of controversial figure, but that was the very first kind of vaccine, if you will. And then we have Louis Pasteur, who developed a vaccine for rabies in the 1800s, and his Pasteur Institute, which then came out with vaccines against multiple things, cholera, typhoid, plague. And then in the 1920s, we started getting vaccines for diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus. All three of these vaccines are actually contained in the same shot. So when you go to get your tetanus booster, you're actually getting vaccines or protection against whooping cough, which is pertussis, and diphtheria, this terrible throat infection that we never see anymore. Our first influenza vaccine came out in 1945. Yellow fever, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, Hep B, Haemophilus influenza, hepatitis A, chickenpox, shingles, varicella, rotavirus, pneumonia, meningitis, HPV, and the list goes on. This needs to be updated. These are all things that have caused untold suffering in humans throughout the years, things that we are now getting under control. Was there a question? Sadie, could you let me know if something's popping up in the comments?
I will. There hasn't been anything yet.
Okay, very good. All right, well, let's keep moving. So now let's take a look here and see the number of cases, right, between the 20th century and the present day. So if you look at smallpox, 20th century annual deaths from smallpox, 48,000 in the 20th century, zero as of 2005 in the United States. Diphtheria, 175,000, zero. Measles, 500,000, 66. That's a huge drop. Unfortunately, this is one that we're still having some trouble keeping under complete control. Pertussis, 147,000 deaths on average per year. That's dropped down significantly, a decrease of 83%, but we can still do better and we need to do better. So pertussis, we have actually seen some outbreaks here in Utah and in other states that don't have strong vaccination policies. Places that are typically more conservative, the Bible Belt, Texas, Oregon, Utah, Idaho, Arizona. Unfortunately, we are seeing outbreaks from year to year in pertussis when this is a preventable disease. If everybody is getting their tetanus booster every 10 years, as they should, and if we're getting our kids vaccinated during the school age years, pertussis really should not be something that afflicts us. So we definitely have some work to do. Polio, dramatic decrease, rubella, tetanus, and H flu, which used to be a very common cause of neonatal death, deaths in infants, has dropped so much, in 99% in the past 100 years. That's amazing. Move on here. All right, I think my screen just froze. There we go. So, for those of us who are more visual, here's kind of a graphical representation of the same thing. So you look at annual US disease cases. So this isn't deaths, but the number of cases per year. In the 1900s, you see this big yellow circle, that's measles. This big purple one, that's pertussis. This big greenish one, that's mumps, rubella, diphtheria, smallpox, H flu, tetanus, polio, and I can't even read that. CRS. And then if you go over here, this is now, as of 2010. So we still have pertussis, which we kind of talked about. Mumps has gone down dramatically, and measles, which would be, which color, this yellow color here. So huge change. And again, the only thing that explains this is vaccines. So this is a really cool graphic. So you probably heard Dr. Fauci and other public health experts recently talking about this effect called herd immunity. But what is it? What is herd immunity? So imagine, if you will, a population like the Native Americans just before first contact with Europeans, a population that had never seen smallpox. It just wasn't something that was endemic. They had no immunity to it because they never needed it. And then you have the Europeans, where smallpox is endemic, meaning that they have small outbreaks year after year. And you see the first outbreak of smallpox in that virgin population. This is what that would have looked like. You have basically 100% rate of infection and a 90+% death rate, right? So that disease rips through that population in record time, killing record numbers of people because nobody's immune to it. Nobody's ever seen it before. And it's rapidly contagious. It has an R naught above 1, right? Which is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard that as well recently. So that's what happened to the Native Americans, right? Completely decimated their population. We don't know how many millions of Native Americans died as a result of smallpox, but it's probably tens of millions. So a genocide, really, that nobody talks about because we just don't know how many people died. But as you start to have some people that are immune to disease, you have these outbreaks that don't quite do as much damage. So you can see that the yellow dots in this scenario represent people who are immune, people who do not spread the infection when an epidemic is ripping through it. So you can see that it slows down things a little bit if you have a population that's even 25% immune. But really, when you start getting higher rates of immunity, rates of 50%, 75, 90, you can see these dramatic reductions in the speed and the impact of an epidemic. So you can see that this is much more branching. It takes longer for this infection, which starts in the center, to reach the corners. And when you get rates of 75%, you can see that it's much easier to trace the individual lines of infection. So an epidemiologist, a person doing contact tracing in this scenario, would have a much easier time than in this scenario, for example. This would be impossible. This would be difficult. But when you get rates of 90% or above, an epidemiologist, the person doing contact tracing, can really stop an outbreak in its tracks, right? Because you can trace this back to the source, isolate that person, vaccinate everyone around them, and you no longer have an outbreak. So this is really why we want high rates of immunization against highly infectious diseases, things like influenza and eventually coronavirus, which we'll talk about. And when you get rates of 95% or above, you truly have an immune herd, a herd that is going to protect these few isolated, vulnerable individuals who either can't get the vaccine or won't, right? So this is what we're shooting for. This is the effect of herd immunity. So let's talk a little bit about immunization schedules. So this is an example of an immunization schedule from 1983, when I was, when I was a little baby. Pretty simple. You get your first shot at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 15 months, 18 months, 4 to 6 years old. It's basically diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and oral polio, and then you get 1 dose of the MMR, the mumps, measles, and rubella. Fairly easy to remember. I feel like this is fairly easy for most parents to swallow. Let's take a look at our current vaccination schedule. It's a little bit more complex than that. So here are the different vaccines that are given, and up here across the top are the ages and the age ranges. So you can see a lot of things have been added to the routine childhood vaccination schedule since the 80s. We now have hepatitis B, we've got rotavirus, we've got H flu, we've got pneumonia, and influenza as well. Chickenpox, varicella vaccine. So I had chickenpox as a kid, but my kids never will, and my grandkids never will because of the varicella vaccine. You probably know many adults in your family and friends who've had shingles. There's even a vaccine for that now, but shingles eventually will go the way of the dinosaur as well because of the childhood chickenpox vaccine. So this is an evolving thing. This is obviously much more complex than the schedule from the 80s, and a little bit more difficult, I think, for most parents and non-medical professionals to either understand or to accept. And so there's a challenge that doctors and nurses have to take on themselves to kind of educate the public and explain, why all of these vaccines are recommended, especially so young. You can see the first, the 2-month well child visit. That's a lot of shots to give a 2-month-old, and many parents are understandably concerned about, is this safe? I'm going to give my newborn all of these shots on the same day. And honestly, I just try to reassure them that yes, in fact, your newborn's immune system is primed and ready to make antibodies against everything right now, and this is the perfect time to give them all of these shots, because if we do it now, they're going to make good amounts of antibodies that will last them their whole life. They'll be immune against these things their whole life and will not need boosters later on. And so that's why we do that. But this is always changing. Whenever we get a new vaccine and a new recommendation, we update this schedule. So I understand if people feel a little overwhelmed, but that's okay. You don't have to remember this. That's my job and my nurses' jobs. We'll walk you through it. So and here's the current adult schedule. So you can see an annual influenza vaccine, a Tdap or tetanus booster every 10 years. And if you were one of those people who only got one dose of the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine as a child, we also recommend a second dose, or to check you, to make sure that you are indeed immune to measles, as unfortunately we have had some outbreaks of that recently. Varicella, or the shingles vaccine, is now recommended for adults 50 and over who had chickenpox as a child. Zoster virus, HPV, that's an emerging topic, which I'd love to talk about another time. And then our pneumonia shots, our Prevnar 13 and Pneumovax 23, later in life for those adults over age 65 or younger, if they have a good reason for that, such as heart disease, diabetes, or if they're a smoker or have asthma. So what's on the horizon? Kind of what is coming up in terms of vaccines? So, in 2017, there were 82 licensed vaccine products that were available in the United States, but that number is increasing. Currently, there are vaccines in development against HIV, Zika virus, Ebola, malaria, and of course, COVID-19. And we'll talk about that near the end of this talk today. I'm sure that people have questions about that. I'd be happy to take those. There are also new ways of delivering vaccines, not just the shot, but patches that we can put on people's skin that have small sugar-coated glass vials that essentially deposit the antigen underneath the skin without the trauma of a shot. And we're seeing people using this idea of stimulating the immune system to fight against other things or to protect against other things that have to do with the immune system, such as autoimmune disease like type 1 diabetes. That maybe if we could identify people at risk of developing type 1 diabetes, if we have a first degree relative, for example, with type 1, we know that their risk is somewhere around 50%. And if we can catch those people young in life and protect them from developing this issue with a vaccine, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could prevent type 1 diabetes or lupus or other autoimmune diseases? And then in the future, we do expect that more and more disease processes, like different types of cancer, can be prevented with the application of vaccines. There are already 2 vaccines that are FDA approved that do protect people from cancer. One is the hepatitis B vaccine, which has been shown to dramatically decrease the rates of hepatocellular carcinoma. And the other is HPV, the human papillomavirus, which causes the vast majority of cervical cancer in women. That is a preventable cancer now with our HPV vaccine, which is indicated for young boys and girls. But we also think that there are possible applications for the prevention of heart disease, dementia, and other chronic illnesses with vaccine early in life. Pretty exciting.
And Dr. Roberts, we have 2 questions. The first is, do you get a shingles vaccine if you've already had shingles?
Good question. So that is not the technical indication because you don't get quite as much benefit. The benefit risk ratio isn't quite as favorable for people who have already had shingles. But in my own practice, I'll tell you that I still recommend the shingles vaccine for my patients who've already had shingles. And the reason for that is that there is some evidence that it can help decrease the chances of getting another episode of shingles. But more importantly, there's a terrible complication of the shingles, something called post-herpetic neuralgia, which is it's rare, but it's a horrible issue that even after the rash, the burning, uh, you know, uh, little pus-filled or blistery rash that people get, even after that is gone, you can still have persistent and sometimes even permanent pain because that nerve has been permanently damaged. Interesting little historical side note. A lot of medical historians actually believe that that's what happened to Vincent van Gogh, that he actually had shingles of the face, and even after the rash had resolved, he was left with permanent severe pain on the side of his face, which led him to amputate his own ear. But he likely suffered from what we call phantom pain, where he still had pain even though the ear was gone, eventually driving him into insanity and to take his own life. So it's a very serious illness. And the real benefit of the shingles vaccine is it protects you from that. People who get the shingles vaccine are almost have a 0% chance of developing post-herpetic neuralgia if they have another outbreak. So if it were me and I had shingles, I would still get the new shingles vaccine, the Shingrix. It is in short supply. It's really hard for doctors' offices and pharmacies to keep it in stock. For some reason, the company has really suffered from supply issue ever since it came out about 5 years ago. But it's definitely something that I would recommend for all people over the age of 50.
And I believe you just answered the second question. Is there still a shortage of the shingles vaccine?
Yes, there is, unfortunately. The company has been promising that they're going to get this back, this supply chain issue under control, but I haven't seen that bear out yet. So we have very intermittent supply in my office, and I know that that's pretty common around the country. Yes, the new shingles vaccine is called Shingrix. It's even recommended for people who had the old shingles vaccine, the Zostavax, because it's just a better shot. It works better and it's safer. Good questions. Any other questions? If not, we'll keep going. We're making good progress here. This slide is just to show that over time, people do get. So I saw a question about how many shots is the shingles vaccine. So it is 2. The shots are separated by at least 1 month, but you don't want to wait more than a year in between the two, or else you have to start over. So between 1 and 12 months is what I would say the separation between those 2 shots. Yep. So after, so here's, tracking of, for example, a young woman from birth to age 70, 78, 79. So you can see over the course of a lifetime, this person, if they got all of the recommended vaccines, would get over 100 shots in their lifetime. And that's a lot, and some shots do contain preservatives. And so there's a very legitimate question here is, is this, are these chemicals that I'm injecting into my body over the course of my lifespan, is this going to cause a problem for me? For example, one of the preservatives is very commonly found in multi-dose vials of the flu shot is a mercury-containing preservative. And so a lot of people worry about like mercury poisoning or heavy metal poisoning. And I think that's a very legitimate concern. And eventually we need to do something about this to where we can limit or combine vaccines together so we don't have as many shots that are needed. One of the other big developments that's underway, it's not ready for prime time yet, but I expect that in our lifetimes we will see this, is that it is a universal flu vaccine, a flu vaccine which you get once in childhood, which will protect you from all of the different strains of flu that there possibly ever could be. Because right now we're locked in an arms race with influenza. We have to come up with a new shot every season because the different strains are mutating, and our shot from last year won't work this year. So eventually we're going to have a shot which will protect you from every possible combination of H and N proteins of the flu virus capsule. And then you'll just get one, right? Where our children will just get one shot that will protect them from all flu forever. And the number of lifetime shots will dramatically drop as a result of that. But I definitely don't want to poo-poo people's concerns when they bring them up to me about vaccines, because a lot of them are legitimate. But unfortunately, there is also a lot of misinformation out there about the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, which is my job to dispel. So let's talk a little bit about the cost, right? We talked about the number of shots. Let's talk about how much that costs. So if you look at the number of, the amount of money that you would spend on a child receiving their recommended vaccines up through their 18th birthday. So in 1985, that would have been about $45 worth of shots. I think that's a very justifiable cost. Nobody would, bat an eye about that. In 1995, that price had tripled up to 155. And now in the 2020 kind of era, we're looking at several $1,000s worth of vaccines. And one of the big ones here is the HPV vaccine, which is a fairly expensive vaccine. It's a series that requires either 2 or 3 shots, depending on when you get your first dose. And each one of those is about $300. And so you can see that added to the price tag quite a bit. Now, vaccines are usually 100% covered as preventative care under most insurance plans, but not all. And so, this can become an issue, especially for people who are uninsured, right? Now, that brings me to an important government program. So there is a program called the Vaccines for Children program, the VFC program, which does guarantee payment from the government for recommended childhood vaccines. So if a family can't afford health insurance, children are still able to get all of their recommended vaccines through the VFC program, but you do have to apply, similar to applying for Medicaid, to get that benefit. So cost is rising. Cost across the board for healthcare services are rising in the United States, and that's definitely something that we need to address. So I kind of jumped ahead of myself here. So VFC, Vaccines for Children, was established in 1993 after a large measles outbreak. It pays for vaccines for uninsured, underinsured, Medicaid, and Native Americans. All advisory council on immunization practices vaccines are approved. I'll get into what ACIP is in a moment. These vaccines are purchased by the CDC and are distributed to states. You might want to check with your doctor's office. Not all doctor's offices are credentialed with VFC. Not all doctor's offices have VFC vaccines, but most do, especially pediatric offices. And this has been made so that Congress does not have to appropriate money for it year after year. So this has broken out of the partisan cycle of budget approvals. This is always going to be guaranteed. I see we have a raised hand. Mr. Butler, what is your question? I think he's still muted.
All right, I've unmuted you, Chris Butler.
Give him a couple more seconds here. Okay, well, if you remember your question, please do bring it up later. There's another question here I've heard. Can you read that for me, Sadie? It popped up and then it went away.
Yes, it says, I have heard discussion from people who are vegan about their beliefs that vaccines have ingredients from animals. What do you say to patients with this concern?
So yes, but many vaccines are made using an animal vector. Chicken egg is usually the most common, and so that's why people are usually asked before they get a flu shot if they have an egg allergy, even though that's not a 100% contraindication for getting the flu shot. It's just something we have to be aware of. So this is a little bit more technical than I was really planning on for the purposes of this this presentation, but I'm very happy to go through it. So most modern vaccines are no longer what we call killed vaccines, where we take the virus particle and we boil it, or we put it in ethanol or formaldehyde to kill it. Most modern vaccines are what we call recombinant vaccines, which is based on DNA technology. So what we do is we actually sequence the genome of the virus or the bacteria or whatever it is that we're trying to give a person protection for. And we put that little piece of DNA or RNA, as is the case for most viruses, we put that piece of genetic material inside another vector, usually a chicken egg embryo. And we co-opt that embryo to make huge amounts of a viral protein, usually a protein that's found on the surface of the virus, like the H and N proteins on the flu virus, for example. we take those proteins and we concentrate them into a liquid. That's what goes into the vaccine. So that's how I can tell people with a certainty that you cannot get the flu from the flu shot because it's not the whole virus. The virus isn't in there as a whole particle. All it is are small components of the capsule of the virus that are contained in the shot. So that's how most modern shots work. There are some notable exceptions. There are still some live vaccines that are given. Polio is a live vaccine. The flu mist that's given as a nasal spray for children is a live vaccine. MMR, mumps, measles, and rubella, is still a live vaccine. But most vaccines are recombinant, based on genetic technology. And we do rely on animal vectors to produce those. And also, many vaccines are produced using E. coli, a very common gut bacteria that we have genetically modified into basically viral particle factories in big vats where we grow these things. So, for people who are vegan, or have other philosophical, moral, or religious, beliefs that make it impossible for them to ingest animal products, I can see that being problematic. However, I think we all have to be pragmatic as well. I've seen many people, for example, who have dietary restrictions because of kosher laws or things being halal, who will make exceptions, or Jehovah's Witnesses who can't accept human blood products, who will make exceptions in rare or life-threatening cases. And I feel like we all need to be somewhat flexible when it comes to our health and the public health. So that's a good question. I don't feel like I have a perfect answer for every patient. I think it has to be kind of case by case. All right, so let's go ahead and move on here. So there are several federal committees that are involved with vaccine development and approval and safety. And you can see kind of this diagram here. And these are all under the Department of Health and Human Services, which the CDC is as well, the National Institutes of Health, the ACIP Advisory Committee. I won't get too much into that, but you can see it's all pretty organized and worked out. And let's talk a little bit about safety. So there is a system for reporting adverse events or side effects and harm that happen to people as a result of getting the vaccine. This system is called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. And they have offices all throughout the country. And anytime, for example, in my office, if I give a person a vaccine and they develop an allergic reaction to it, we have to submit a report that a person is harmed due to a vaccine. And we have to include the lot number, the expiration date, and all of that important information when we submit that report, so that this system can keep an eye on manufacturers and see if there are patterns emerging where maybe the manufacturer did that batch wrong. Maybe there's too much antigen in that batch and it's causing reactions all around the country. It wasn't just a fluke in my office. And this body has caught issues before and have really stepped in and prevented harm. Let me just jump ahead here to a really important case that they caught. So back in the 90s, there was an oral rotavirus vaccine that was given to children. And we saw a very small number of children who were developing this really rare issue called intussusception, where their small intestine would actually telescope into their large intestine, causing a blockage in their bowels. And this vaccine adverse event reporting system caught this, this little blip in the statistical prevalence of this issue, tied it back to this vaccine, and got the vaccine taken off the market within the course of months. So you can see that in July is when they started to report these, and by October, the vaccine was off the market. So, they are really trying their best to keep us safe and to watch for potential issues with vaccines. And they move quickly when needed to get these things off the market if they're not safe. So who makes recommendations for vaccines? That is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. This is administered by the CDC. There are groups from industry, meaning big pharma, groups from the Board of Education, and other liaison groups that are allowed to attend their meetings. Their meetings are all public. Their minutes are recorded and posted. Anybody can come and speak and air, concerns about their recommendations when they come up with a new recommendation for, this is what we recommend for children and adults. This is not the group that dictates which school districts require which vaccines. That is left up to the states. But this is the group that provides recommendations for the entire country. So school immunizations are, as I mentioned, required by states. All states have some form of, required immunizations for public school. Many states allow exceptions. Utah has 3 exceptions that are allowed: medical, religious, and personal. And there's the section of the Utah statutory code if you want to look that up. But we've definitely seen that states that allow more exceptions have more preventable diseases, which makes sense, right? If more people are opting out and considering themselves, to be an exception to the rule, you're going to have a higher rate of outbreaks of those diseases in those places. And so as a state that allows quite a few exceptions, Utah often has one of the worst rates in the country for preventable diseases, unfortunately, things like pertussis, measles, etc. And we've definitely seen that there's a correlation in outbreaks in states where a lot of exceptions are allowed, or exceptions are very easy to obtain. So one last word on that. We are coming into a respiratory season here in Utah, where the flu shot is now available. We just actually got our first shipment today in my clinic for our flu vaccine. I'm going to get it today. I'm going to have my wife bring herself and my kids in today to get their shot. I wish that our state was not so lenient. I feel like while I understand the reasons behind it, with our population and just the general feeling towards authority and the federal government and skepticism of science here in Utah, it makes sense why we have so many exceptions, but I feel like we are doing our populace a disservice by allowing so many exceptions, and I feel like we would do best to reduce the number of exceptions that were allowed and to follow the example of some other states in the country, like California, that have really done away with personal exceptions and still just allowed, medical and in limited cases, religious exemptions from vaccine. If people want to attend public school or want to work in the service industry or in healthcare, I feel like, a mandatory, have to have these immunizations across the board isn't necessary. But at least for public schools and kind of service sectors, I believe that we would be better and we would be healthier if we did away with some of those exceptions. Rant over. Let's talk a little bit about the COVID vaccine, and I'm sure that people have questions about this. So this is a cool little tool that comes from the New York Times called the Coronavirus Vaccine Tracker. So you've probably all heard about the phases of development. So phase 1, 2, 3, which is the last phase of clinical trials that's required before a vaccine can be approved for use. So there are currently 3 vaccines that have been approved for limited use, not here in the United States, but outside of the US, 2 in China and 1 in Russia. I think that was personally a mistake for those vaccines to be approved before they were finished with phase 3 trials, but they didn't ask me. Here in the United States, we currently have between 3 and 5 vaccines for COVID-19, which are in phase 3. The one that's closest to being approved is the one that is being produced by Moderna, I think a San Francisco-based company, and they have a close partnership with the National Institutes of Health, which I'm pretty sure is going to be the first COVID-19 vaccine approved for use in this country. And when will that happen? We think that will probably happen by the end of November or early December. We may see it be used in groups prior to that who are at high risk, groups like healthcare providers, emergency responders, the critically ill or the ill, aged and infirm. We may see it rolled out in those groups prior to full approval, but it won't be ready for the general public until it's been thoroughly vetted and approved by the FDA. And I'll just show you this tool really quickly because I was messing around with it this morning and I thought it was pretty neat. So you go to the New York Times here, anything COVID-19 related is going to be free without a subscription through the rest of the year. And you go down here to this section where it says filter the list of vaccines by where they are. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. If you click on phase 3, you see this vaccine Moderna and National Institute of Health. And you can kind of read the timeline from when it was first launched in March and where they're at. And you can look a little bit at some of the promising results that are coming out from these trials and the issues they're having with their patents, which I thought was kind of cool. So what will it take to end the pandemic? Now, I get asked that a question a lot, like, when is this going to be over? When are we going to actually be able to get back to normal life? And there's no hard and fast answer to that. You know, you've probably heard Dr. Fauci say he thinks it'll be the end of 2021 before things really get back to normal. It could be sooner than that. It certainly could. I think that's a pretty conservative estimate. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that we might be able to get back to normal sooner. But what it will take is a mixture of different strategies. We've got to continue our social distancing and physical distancing, hand washing, and other measures that are being done on the population level. We need better medical treatments, and there's good news there. We are seeing much more effective treatments for very acutely ill people. We've seen the death rate drop by almost 30% here in the United States due to better medical treatments, things like steroids, blood thinning medication, and other antiviral medications that are being developed for COVID-19. But of course, the most important piece here is going to be having an effective vaccine and making sure that we get enough people to get the vaccine where we get ourselves up to an immune population and an immune herd. There is a risk that COVID might be here with us to stay. Not that it will continue to be the pandemic, plague that it currently is, but that it might have seasonal returns, that we might actually see coronavirus pop up again and again every year, because now it's got its hooks in us. And there will always be a small population of humans all throughout the year who are carrying it and spreading it. And that's what we call an endemic disease, which would be very unfortunate. We haven't had a new endemic disease take hold in the human population for a long time. But because of the failure of many governments to get this under control in a timely fashion, that might be something that we are going to be part of the new normal. We're actually going to see coronavirus cases every year. I think that that's very likely, unfortunately, given the extent to which it's infected our population. But it doesn't mean that it's going to bring our economy to a standstill every year, like it did this time. And kind of in summary, vaccination is in the public interest. It is a good thing. It has saved lives. Outreach and education are essential. And if you have questions about vaccines, please talk to your doctor and don't Google it. Don't listen to people on the news. Some news sources are more reputable than others, but really, trust the experts. That's what we went to medical school to learn about. The groups that make recommendations here, they have our best interest at heart. They are open to, they're open to recommendations from the public, and they're constantly watching and trying to keep us safe. The vaccine safety system is a robust system. It works, but we still have lots of work to do. There's some additional reading for anybody interested. And with the minute that we have left, I'd be happy to take any more questions.
There is one question in the chat box. It says, are anti-vaxxers going to set us back?
Well, in some ways they already have. I think anti-vaxxers are directly responsible for higher rates of problems like whooping cough or pertussis infections that have been on the rise recently. 2 years ago when we saw that big outbreak of measles across the country, that was directly related to the actions of the anti-vax movement. I think that the anti-vaxxers are poised to do a lot of harm this next year as we try to get the coronavirus vaccine out to the public. I expect that there will be significant pushback to that, and that they really could cause a lot of unnecessary suffering and death. I do see them as my philosophical foe, and I've made it kind of one of my life's goals is to bring the fight to them and to win, right? To help people overcome their concerns and hesitancy about getting vaccinated. So I see another question here. Will each country develop its own coronavirus vaccine? So something cool that happened, when this outbreak started in China back in January and February was we really saw this rush to make a vaccine, and it wasn't just inside big pharma, right? It was all over the world. Independent companies were starting to pop up with new ideas about how to make vaccines. Moderna was actually a company that I think didn't even exist before this. Just a couple of smart people with a good idea who got together and launched a company, and lo and behold, it's now our number one contender. Probably going to be the first vaccine launched in this country. But we also saw groups from universities all around the country, or all around the world, rather, working to make a vaccine. So, but it's not necessary for each country to have its own vaccine. They just have to license it. They just have to purchase the vaccines from someone that they trust. Went through a vigorous process to get it tested and approved. Um, Normally, the body that would control or help to coordinate kind of the logistics of that, getting those vaccines out to small countries that don't have the resources to make their own vaccine would be the World Health Organization. But unfortunately, because of politics, the World Health Organization has lost a lot of its support from the United States this year because of our current administration. And that is absolutely going to have a negative impact on getting the coronavirus vaccine distributed to those poorer countries that have fewer resources. I think that's a real mistake that we've stepped away from the WHO. And I hope that our next administration will right that wrong.
The next question we have is, what kind of treatment do you provide to COVID patients at this point?
So in the outpatient setting, I've had about 5 or 6 patients in the last few months who've caught COVID and been able to successfully quarantine at home and recover at home without needing to be hospitalized. I've also had a couple of patients who have needed to be hospitalized. So those are very different treatments. In kind of outpatient home setting, it's supportive, right? We're treating fever with anti-inflammatories and anti-pyretics, things like Tylenol. Ibuprofen has been shown to be safe. We're treating the symptoms of cough with, albuterol and other medicines which we use to treat asthmatics. Um, and really just supporting them, making sure that they're getting enough fluids, et cetera, and allowing the disease to kind of run its course at home. In the hospital setting, the treatment has really evolved. At first we were trying lots and lots of different things. We were trying medicines like hydroxychloroquine, which came out of this small study that was done in China that showed that people with lupus were not getting the disease, and so we thought maybe it's because of the medicines that they're on, like their immunosuppressants. And so that's why we started trying to use that. We actually found that does no good. In fact, it causes more harm than good, so we stopped using it. But other medicines that we're using to lower the risk of inflammation, blood clots, and multi-system failure have been shown to be effective. One of the other drugs or treatments that we were really hopeful about at first, which is kind of ending up being a dud, is convalescent plasma. So using plasma from people who have already recovered from COVID to treat people who are currently ill. We were very hopeful that that would be a useful tool. Unfortunately, that has not turned out to be the case, according to the most recent studies I've done. So we're still looking for the right cocktail of drugs to treat severely sick COVID patients, but we're getting there. Are there any other questions? If not, I thank you so much for your attention and time. I hope that this was helpful and hope everybody learned something, and I'd be more than happy to answer other questions on the side.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. And for everybody, I will send you our flyer for the employee flu clinic this year. The times and dates and any other questions that you may have should be answered in that flyer.
All right, thank you all.
And thank you all so much. We'll be seeing you soon, I hope, Dr. Roberts.
All right, very good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.